It's a step beyond a simple recognition of the value of stories and towards the value and the nourishment that we find through books. A couple of weeks ago, I had this brilliant weekend where I had 2 great books. And at the end of that weekend, I felt nourished. I felt like I'd had some space for me just to be immersed in books, immersed in literature, immersed in these stories that caught my attention. And it felt like an active process of relaxing. Felt like I'd restored some of my energy. It felt like a gift. And I love that about literature. I love the way that literature can make us feel, as well as the education that it can provide us or the understanding it can give us.
Welcome to the Choice Space podcast. I'm Dr. Lee David, GP, author, and CBT therapist. In today's episode, we're exploring something that many of us wish we had more time for: reading. In a world full of social media, emails, and constant demands on our attention, books and stories offer a different kind of space. They may bring comfort, clarity, or a pause, yet we often underestimate how much they can support our mental health. For many people, reading helps us make sense of difficult emotions, reduces the sense of being alone, or may offer a step back from the intensity of everyday life. Stories can give us language to name experiences that may otherwise be hard to describe, and can create connection with ourselves, with others, and with characters who may stay with us long after the page is turned. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Charley Baker, Associate Professor of Mental Health at the University of Nottingham, whose research and writing explore how literature can help us understand psychological distress and experiences that don't always fit neatly into clinical language. Charley, welcome. Could you introduce yourself and share what first drew you to literature as a way of understanding wellbeing?
Hi, thanks, Lee. My name's Charley Baker. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham. So what drew me to literature and wellbeing? So firstly, as a child, I was a voracious reader, and I remember very, very clearly how calm I found books and how I would get stressed if I didn't have books. And both my parents were very generous in buying me lots and lots of books. I can remember when I was younger, the joy of being able to immerse myself in different stories. And then when I was working in a crisis response and home treatment team and writing my PhD on fiction, particularly postmodern fiction and psychosis, a job was advertised at the University of Nottingham that was just the perfect job for me. And the job was to be the research assistant to explore madness in post-war British and American fiction. So I was paid for 3 years to read books, and it was incredible. So that resulted in a book and a number of different podcasts and a conference, and really launched what we wanted to do at Nottingham around health humanities.
It sounds like there's a real breadth of the impact of literature and reading for you right across different areas, from childhood right the way through your PhD and then into your current role. Let's start with the importance, what it brings to us. So it feels like reading is much more than a form of light entertainment. It feels like it brings something really important for our mental health, for well-being, and for life in general. Through your experience of so many different strands of exploring the role of literature and reading, what is it that you feel that it brings?
So I think there's several things that it brings for me. Putting to one side the joy of reading, which is in its own right a wonderful, wonderful thing. I think there's a couple of key things to me that reading about different people's experiences can help. So the first one, I think, is it helps us to empathize with other people, whether that's a character in a story who really speaks to us, or whether that's somebody who's a peripheral character to a story, but who has a particular experience that we can relate to. I think it helps us to think differently about people's experience. And sometimes when we're reading about something that's completely unfamiliar to us, it's really got that educational value for thinking differently. And we're in a world currently where we've never been more divided. So literature, I think it helps to bridge that gap, and those gaps are ever increasing. So it gives us that real sense of understanding different people's perspectives and understanding different people's point of view, whether we agree with them or otherwise.
Yeah, I love the idea of all of those aspects, learning about different parts of the world. And I certainly for myself, I think I learn more from reading literature around different periods of history, different countries and different cultures than I would from reading a non-fiction book, because my brain seems to absorb it much more easily when it's set in a literary style. It's a different way to educate ourselves. It doesn't quite feel like education. It just feels like immersion, doesn't it?
It does. And that's the other real benefit, I think, is that immersion in the other world is so different in a fictional world. And I don't even think it needs to be a literary fiction world. It can be an accessible book. So it might be one of the light reads that we might pick up at an airport, for example, but it's just something about that immersion and that being in a world where we're seeing things anew and seeing things afresh. Really good example of that for me recently was Coco Mellor's Blue Sisters. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel, but one of the key characters, the sister, has endometriosis. And as a woman with endometriosis, I've never seen that represented in fiction before. And I've never seen such an empathic perspective as well on using pain relief, for example, and where there might be concerns from a medical point of view about the overuse of pain relief versus somebody's quality of life where they're really struggling. And that really, I think, brought home to me exactly what literature can do. It can help us to bridge that gap. And I know I recommended it far and wide. I know a number of my friends who read it said, I get it now. I get how it feels. And actually, that immersion in that world with the three sisters was just a completely different way of understanding and explaining experiences that I could really relate to.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And I'm really thinking about that empathy and how literature is so effective at being able to create that. And I was mulling this over before we recorded today, and I was thinking about the difference, for example, between watching a program, maybe even watching a movie, and literature and reading. And there is that immersion, and perhaps we're more able to then relate. There's more dialogue about the perspective of others. And it feels like it's a bit less threatening in some way, that we're able to hear it more, because sometimes people get quite closed off and they're not as willing to hear things that feel uncomfortable. And I just wondered what you feel helps us break that down, because it does encourage listening to one another in a different way, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think it is super important. I think there's something around reading in a book that is so much more intimate than watching on a program. So maybe it's something around the amount of attention we have to pay to be able to immerse ourselves in a book. There's something about the intimacy of reading, I think, that means we can challenge our own preconceptions without that confrontation that you might get when it's a conversation or when it's a TV program or a radio show. It's something much more private where we can mull over our beliefs that might feel unusual, or that we might worry that we're going to be perceived differently if we talk about them. It's that kind of safe opportunity in that intimate space, I think. And that's certainly something I've talked a lot about in writing about the use of literature in clinical education in particular. So when we look at things like books that have characters who self-harm, for example, self-harm can be incredibly misunderstood by society more broadly, and in particular in different clinical settings. In a book, there's an opportunity to hear and see the person's thoughts so that you can hear and see the things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get to. And I think understanding more complex or stigmatized issues through different characters' experiences. I really think that's something valuable because it's so much safer to do that through literature than it is to do it in other settings.
And I think there's something about inviting it into us. When we read, it happens within us. It's in our own space. And so actually how we approach the content is different because it feels like we're then experiencing it from within rather than perhaps other forms of entertainment where it's outside. And so it's a very interesting dynamic about where we meet some of the content. I'm really interested in the work you've done around self-harm because it's a topic which can be very challenging for people. It's very important. We know that many young people are affected by self-harm, and we're wanting to have narratives that support and create understanding. What's your experience about how literature can support in these more complex areas of care?
So I think in relation to self-harm and broader mental health and illness, but I'll focus on self-harm in particular, there are a number of different things relating to self-harm where people might feel completely unable to articulate in words verbally what's happening for them internally. And we might hear that in reading in a different way. So we might hear in reading how somebody feels ashamed, for example, by their self-harm, and how that is repeated or reinforced with poor experiences of care that they might have, or with a dismissal, for example, of you're just another teenager self-harming. We don't need to take that seriously. But I think it also gives us a reminder that what we're seeing and what we're hearing is a fraction of what's going on for somebody. And if we start to think more deeply about how that person is experiencing the world around them and experiencing their emotions, again, I think seeing that in writing is much less confronting than seeing it in a clinical consultation. And it gives us that opportunity to think critically ourselves about what our preconceptions are, what our beliefs are, what might be happening for somebody, the kind of what's the person saying is going on versus what's actually going on. If we think about self-harm and mental illness as an iceberg, what we see in the clinical encounter is the tip of the iceberg, the visible part, what's happening for the person, and what we see replicated in stories, in first-person narration, in fiction, what we see is what's underneath the surface. And thinking about these experiences that might be underneath the surface in a safe environment, I think gives us ways of responding to people that doesn't mean we freeze, and it doesn't mean that we put our own defenses up. I think it gives that real deep, comprehensive understanding of just how different everybody's experiences are too. But with self-harm, particularly in a clinical or in a friendship or a family setup, our desperation as a human being meeting somebody with self-harm is often that we want them to stop doing that. We want them to not hurt themselves. We want them to be safe. We want them to not feel as terrible as they might be feeling. And actually, reading about self-harm gives us the confidence to pause and to be with someone rather than reacting very quickly into a protective mode. It gives us that ability to just sit quietly with someone's distress and say, I hear you, and I hear what you're trying to say, and I'm here and I'm going to listen. It just gives us that space and the confidence to do that, I think.
Yeah, so thinking about any intense emotional response like self-harm, other types of mental health challenges that people may experience, the idea of an iceberg feels really powerful where there's something maybe at the tip of the surface. It might be distress. It might be the self-harm itself is the bit that shows up. But underneath that is so much complexity. There's thoughts, there's emotions, there's relationship experiences, there's stuff going on at school, there's pressure, social media, all of those things wound up in ways that are probably very difficult to unpick and quite difficult to talk about. And yet they're all still very relevant. And so perhaps us being able to find some space to pause and be with it and have that curiosity. And perhaps literature helps us to create a curiosity to understand. I want to hear more about this. Can I understand more about that? And to sit and be with the person, as you say, with their emotions. And also for the person themselves, I think when emotions are very intense and sometimes there are traumatic experiences, it is very hard to put those things into words, I think. and we don't always have the language to be able to clearly articulate what's going on. And maybe literature helps to create some words to describe things that otherwise just feel very jumbled up and very complicated and then perhaps overwhelming as a consequence.
I think getting that language from reading about other people's experience, I think, is something that's so valuable and something that we can't replicate in any other ways. So it might be that it's a short piece that's in a newspaper, but it sparks our interest and wanting to learn a bit more. Or it might be in a clinical setting, a patient that we see and we think, I don't understand where you're coming from, or I can't understand what's going on for you, so I want to learn more. And I think going away and learning through fiction is a really enjoyable way of doing that. There's a couple of different ways that trauma can be represented in helping us to understand. And an example of that, I think, that's really strong was when the 9/11 attacks happened. There was a huge literature that came out after then of authors trying to work through their own trauma of 9/11. And those of us who witnessed it vicariously from the safety of our sofas, for example, we couldn't understand it. It was too big for us to have a language to understand initially. Again, reading about it gives us a different language and gives us a different approach. So trauma and collective trauma, I think, has a really important role to play in terms of understanding things like our experiences as women, for example, and our experiences of being a woman in a very masculine world. It might be that it's our experiences of different cultures. It's something that gives us a different insight. Things like the kite runner are really important examples of that. Again, it's that shared understanding that we can develop, or not a shared understanding, but an understanding that experience might be unfamiliar to us, but really deeply affecting that person that we're talking to or that we're seeing.
This is the Choice Pause, a short 2 to 3 minute tool drawn from my books and therapy practice that you'll hear in every episode, each time with something different to help you pause, notice, and choose your next step. Today's pause is opening space for creativity. Take a slow breath in and a longer breath out. Let your shoulders drop and let go of any tension in your jaw or around your eyes. As we pause, can you notice, just briefly, whether there's a part of you that enjoys exploring ideas or stories, or discovering something new about the world or about yourself, even in small ways? There's no need to be certain or to change anything right now. Simply allow a little space for curiosity and discovery. Creativity often begins in tiny moments. A thought, a question, a spark of interest. Those gentle pauses where we find ourselves thinking, I wonder. Where we find ourselves noticing something about ourselves or about the world. Rest in that feeling for a moment. The ease of not striving, but just noticing and being curious. Now think about one small, easy creative choice that you might make today. A doodle, journaling, noticing something beautiful, spending a minute with a book or a magazine that you enjoy, noticing what you need and finding 1 or 2 small ways to lift your well-being. Take one more slow breath and carry that sense of openness and curiosity into the rest of your day. It feels like there's a way of engaging people's attention on something really important. So perhaps there may be traumatic experiences that people might be fearful of approaching if it was just a factual representation of this is what happened. But actually with literature, there's something safer about approaching these complex topics that means that we feel more engaged, that we feel more safe. So we are able to learn about something which feels quite distressing, which feels quite scary, in which we might otherwise feel that's too much for me. I feel overwhelmed by the idea of it, but perhaps I can think about engaging in a book which helps me to understand from the inside.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's a step beyond a simple recognition of the value of stories and more towards the value and the nourishment that we find through books. I'm reflecting a lot on this idea of books being nourishing at the moment and books being something that are beyond a comfort as well. So about a couple of weeks ago, I had this brilliant weekend where I had two great books over the course of a weekend. And at the end of that weekend, I felt nourished. I felt like I'd had some space for me just to be immersed in books, immersed in literature, immersed in these stories that caught my attention. And it felt like an active process of relaxing. So relaxing, I think we tend to think of as quite a passive thing that we're doing, but actually the process of reading those two books that weekend felt like I'd restored some of my energy. It felt like a gift. And I love that about literature. I love the way that literature can make us feel, as well as the education that it can provide us or the understanding it can give us.
I often talk about going to the petrol station for a refill and seeing books as actually fuel for well-being, not just relaxation and winding down, but actually something very active that gives us the energy to understand the world, to find a sense of space, to find some joy, find some enjoyment. There may be relaxation, there may be peacefulness, there may also be some excitement. It might be a thriller, and it might actually be activating and really positive. And so we can find the book that we need. Maybe we need something quite slow and settling, or maybe we're sad and we need to explore something around grief, or maybe we would like some light relief from difficulties in our life. So it feels like there's so many options, which is so lovely.
It is. There's books for everything. There's books for every situation and every scenario. I recently was affectionately referred to as a book pusher by a friend who had their own period of challenge and difficulty. And my reaction, as it always is, was to buy them some books. And they'd said that they weren't a great reader. They didn't really read for pleasure. They didn't really read as a hobby, but actually having a book that they could get into made a real difference for them. And I think has been quite transformational, as they now tend to lend me books, which is a real lovely shared moment. But there's something about an active act of kindness. So I'm thinking of you. But more than I'm thinking of you, it's I've read this book and I think it's something you can relate to, or I've read this book and it was hilarious. And at the moment, life is really challenging for you. And I want you to have a little bit of light relief. It was Dorno Porter's So Lucky, which I've recommended to several people and bought several copies of to give people as well, because it was just the joy of being in that book was just wonderful. And it was something that I wanted other people to have as well. And actually, the people who've had that have all been experiencing their own difficulties, life difficulties. And it's just become my go-to book for here's something that might give you a bit of time and space to yourself. And here's something that might just take you outside of your own head a little while.
It's really interesting because we might often think of literature and reading as being quite a solo, solitary activity. But what we're actually talking about here is a number of things that really increase connection. So it might be thinking about somebody as you read a book and thinking, wow, this would be such a great book. I'm going to share it with them. And then having that conversation with them, connecting with them, demonstrating that thought in action by saying, I'd love you to read this. And so that people will feel seen, they'll feel cared about, feel understood as a consequence. So there's a whole, range of ways that we can connect there. And then we've also talked about some of the ways that we might connect with others by increasing our sense of empathy, broadening our ability to understand difficult experiences, being able to sit with people when they're in distress, which can help, I think, often really build connection as well, without doing as much as being present and being willing to be with someone in a dark place, which I think is incredibly powerful, important. So we're really hearing about all of these ways that reading and literature can create connection with others. And I wonder if you had thought of that as an important part of it.
I think it's incredibly important. And I think the act of sharing books and sharing stories is just, it goes back to what I was saying about how nourished I felt. So for me, sharing a book with someone, whether that's a book club, whether it's a personal handing over of a book, because I've read this book and I think you'd really love it, or whether it's going on social media and sharing. I quite often talk on social media about what book I'm reading that weekend and about why I want people to read it. So those connections I think are really important and really powerful. And it's something about thinking with someone and thinking about someone, and that person then feeling cared for, and that person feeling, like you say, recognized and heard and connected with. Connecting with people through stories is the heart of medicine. It's the heart of what we do in healthcare practice, is we listen to people's stories, whether that's I've got the worst sore throat I've ever had and I've got an oral exam in 3 days, or whether that's I've just had a diagnosis of cancer and I don't know what to do with that. The sharing of stories is inherent in every clinical encounter. And I really think that having that in a social setting is just irreplaceable. It goes beyond that simple sharing of a common interest for me. And it's something that's quite an enacted kindness, where you're saying, I think about you, I'm thinking about what you're going through, I'm thinking about what you've experienced, or what a group of people have experienced. So with depression, for example, I celebrate and share and recommend William Styron's Darkness Visible to anybody who's experienced a period of depression. Nothing that I've ever read before or since has represented depression and anxiety in a way that is just such a slim book. It's such a small book, and it's so huge in terms of the areas it covers. So I've bought a number of copies of that for people as well, because again, I think it's something about saying this might be familiar. Some of what you read in this book might speak to you on a different level, and it might help me to understand where you're at, and it might give you a language to be able to talk to me about something. Years ago, I went to a conference and there was a psychologist and their patient with them. And they were talking about how at the very start of therapy, they weren't able to find the words to describe anything at all that had happened. So there was a lot of silence in that therapeutic space initially. And through poems, they started to find a shared language. That idea of poetry forming words when something is so outside of language and outside of our ability to speak it, I think, again, that's just so important, the way we connect differently. And poetry, I think, does that in its own unique way because it's shorter. So it's often a lot more accessible. If somebody's saying, I'm not a big reader, or somebody's afraid of getting into books because they appear too challenging, I think when people are experiencing their own mental health challenges, and I know from my own experience with grief recently that reading was taken away from me for a short period of time and I couldn't get into books. And that was really distressing for me as somebody who reads for everything and who always has 2 or 3 books around me at a time. I have 2 or 3 books in my bag when I go places in case I get stuck somewhere. The thought of being without a book is terrifying for me. So being in a space where, because of grief, I couldn't read was awful. And poetry was what gave me that gentle route back into being able to read again. And I think poetry does that not only through being shorter, but through how much is conveyed with just a few lines and how much we can take away from that and how much we all interpret it differently as well. So there's no one right or wrong way to read a book or to read a poem. And I love that.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that poetry and perhaps shorter books create some space so we can interpret it in different ways. And also we might be invited to contribute a little bit. So we start to add our own perspective. We might start to build our own language around that and create our own narrative using that as a framework, as an initial launching point. So it feels very powerful and may unleash some creativity, perhaps, which allows us to then start to expand and make sense of our own experiences.
Yeah, what you've just said there reminds me of there's two fantastic organisations. One is the Reader organisation, who have really promoted this idea of shared reading aloud, and it's phenomenal. Some of the impact of that, I know, has been really incredible in places like prisons with groups of people. The act of speaking out loud and reading out loud together is really transformative. The other organisation is the Reading Agency, and they have a selection of mood boosting books, and they also have promoted the idea of quick reads or simpler reads. And I know a number of my favourite authors have done those quick read texts. So they are just that little bit more accessible. If somebody's not confident in their literacy, for example, that can be an easier route into reading. The other thing that it makes me think of is the amount of books that came out after A Boy Called It. And there was a huge explosion in books about trauma, books written about people's experiences of abuse and of harm. And they were hugely popular. And actually, I know quite a number of people who reading about other people's trauma made them able to say, yes, that's how I felt too. And that was really powerful for them.
What it makes me think about is finding our own unique relationship with what works for us, what our needs are, being able to recognise that, whether it's books, whether it's poetry, whether it's quick reads, or we just actually want something really long to just absorb us for a period of time. Just trying to recognise that and find a way to hear what our needs are, and then find how literature can support that. We talked about connection with others, but I think there's a connection with ourselves as well that we can also create through this process that helps us to listen to ourselves. I don't think we're always very good at hearing ourselves. Perhaps literature and reading helps us to hear that as well. What do you think?
I think absolutely. I frequently tell my students that they need to take the weekend off and read something that's not to do with their PhD or their assignment. There's something really valuable about giving ourselves the permission to just sit and read. And it's, I think, virtuous in a way that other hobbies maybe are different alongside something like sport. So if we go for a really long walk, we kind of feel good about ourselves. We say, well, I've done a bit of exercise. I've done what I needed to do this weekend. Having the permission to curl up and read with a fantastic book and having that space and that time, I think it's so important. And marking out time to read and time to just be is, again, something that we're not very good at. But like you say, that connection we can get with ourselves around enjoying a book just because it's a really good book, I think is really important. That permission to take a bit of time out.
Well, funnily enough, I think I would often do both at the same time, in that I might often go for a long walk and listen to an audiobook. I read very voraciously as a child, and then because I think I do a lot of work on the computer, I'm doing a lot of reading, I do a lot of writing for my work. And somehow, maybe it's my aging eyes, but it's harder for me to read than it used to be. And so for me, the way back into be able to re-engage was through audiobooks. And so I might go for a long walk and also be listening to a story or a book that really engaged in. And I think it's a really powerful thing for me. And so it's one of the times that I think I don't often suggest multitasking, but I think actually that is a space where both of those are things that are, I feel like they're nourishing me, as you mentioned earlier. And so it feels like actually that's a win on both sides.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, you're the second person in 2 days to tell me about how they walk and listen to audiobooks at the same time. And isn't it fantastic? The best thing about literature, isn't it fantastic that we can access it in different ways? So we can have audible versions of a book or poetry or whatever it might be, or we can have the paper version, or we can have the Kindle version, or we can share it in a book group, for example. Isn't it amazing that we can access these stories in so many different ways? Like you say, if you're walking or if you're housework or whatever it might be, being able to have the story accompanying that is really important and really nice, I think.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great, interesting conversation. It makes me really want to think more about books. I think actually there's a couple of things I'd like to end with. And one is what are your current recommendations of books that you're sharing with people at the moment?
Oh, so that changes on a weekly basis and often several times during the week. So there's a couple of things that I've read recently that I've really enjoyed. So one is The Secret Barrister's most recent book, and it's called The Cutthroat Trial, and that was fantastic. That kept me occupied for hours. And then just this weekend, I've been reading Louise Candlish's A Neighbour's Guide to Murder. It's got a wonderful female narrator who's an older lady, and older women are so underrepresented in fiction. So it's been really lovely reading this story narrated by an older lady who's just had a knee replacement. And it's really given me that sense of, I guess, something that I hadn't felt since I read Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, which is incredible, and everybody should read it. It's a wonderful book. But again, it's something about having quirky or unusual narrators that really gets me sucked in. I love books like that. And then the other books that I've been recommending to everybody, because they're so different. So they're Janice Hallett's collection of books, starting with The Appeal. They're books that are formed of different letters, different emails, different communications, types of narrative. And all of her books in that way are, I think, really accessible compared with the idea of a chunk of a tome of a book. So reading in different formats, I think, is something that I really like. And Janice Hallett does that really well.
So I've just finished listening to a book called Love Untold by Ruth Jones. So that's a book about generations of women, and it's also got a very strong older female character. There's some really strong, powerful women there. It's set in Wales. They've just got such fabulous characterizations. I just love the strength of the characters. They're so believable. And there's a 90-year-old character who's very central to the book, who just really gives me a sense of power and how as women we can lean into that. And there's a lot of humor woven into the book as well, which I really loved. It just felt a really uplifting read for me.
I haven't read that one yet, so it's another one to add to my to-read pile.
Well, I love the fact that it was also narrated by the author herself, and she drew me into that world, which my own head isn't as good at creating the sense of being in South Wales as she can really bring that out. And so it really felt like I was immersed in that place, which for me, the language got woven in. And it's just interesting because I've listened to a few books where they've set in a very strong culture, and actually sometimes having that audio version where you have the accent, you have the language, really helps you to feel more connected to the place. It's a dimension I'd never really come across previously when I was reading, and you say it in your own voice, basically. Whereas this one I heard in her voice, but still inside my head. So it's a sort of interesting kind of mix. So just to finish, we always do the choice-based takeaway. So what would you suggest might be one or two small steps that someone could try with either reading or maybe even writing to support their mood or well-being, to give themselves a little recharge, as we've been saying, in their day-to-day life?
So I think there's two things that are really important. The first one is that if you are not a reader, it's something that you might want to have a think about trying. The local library is incredible. So taking a trip to the local library, asking what kind of books they have, and taking that little step towards getting out the house, saying to somebody, I want something to read. I'm not a big reader, or I am a big reader and I want something new. And then the other thing would be about the importance of recording our own stories. So journaling is something that I think is important, and that can be as simple as a dear diary, today has been awful, or it might be a few notes that are jotted down on your phone in the notes app to remind you of how you felt with a particular book or a particular event. So I think that's really important as well, thinking about how you share stories with yourself and how you keep memories to yourself, and journaling I think is a good way of doing that.
I love that. And I'd add just picking something really small. So it might be a magazine. It might be, as you're in the supermarket, they have lots of books in there that you can just pick one up and think, oh, that looks interesting. And they're often quite low cost. So it's very accessible in our day-to-day lives. Just have a go and see where it goes, and listen to what your needs are. Do you need something light? Do you need something a bit heavier? Do you need something to recognize emotion? What's going on for us? I think that would be a real key one for me. And my other one that I would say, which is possibly controversial, interested in what you think, is that if you really don't like it, stop. Don't feel you have to keep reading something that you're not enjoying, because there's so many different types of books, there's so many different types of literature, and it might just be that it's not a connect. And so just pop it down and pick something else up.
Yeah, if you've got 20 pages or 50 pages or 100 pages in and you're going, this is awful, or this feels like a chore, and it's something that's sat on your bedside table for a week because you don't want to go back into it, bin it. Don't bin it. Put it to one side, send it to a charity shop, pass it on to someone else and say, I didn't enjoy it, but you might like it. Life is too short to spend it on books that we're not enjoying.
Thanks for listening to the Choice Space podcast. I hope this conversation has offered you a little more room to pause, breathe, and find your own way forward. We've linked the ways you can connect with Charlie in the show notes. And if today's episode has been helpful, please download, follow, and share with someone else who might find the space helpful as well. I'd love to have you with me for the next episode. Until then, take care and keep making space for what matters most.